I'm Charlotte, and I thought I knew what betrayal felt like, until the night the mountains swallowed my world whole. My husband Ethan and I escaped to the rugged wilderness, craving a break from the suffocating routine of our 12-year marriage, hoping to rediscover the fire that once burned between us. But as our old SUV broke down on a desolate, twisting road, surrounded by looming peaks and an eerie silence, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the biting cold. Stranded, vulnerable, and with strangers emerging from the shadows, I faced a choice that could shatter everything I held dear. What did I do when the line between right and wrong blurred under that endless, starlit sky? Picture this: a single jagged peak piercing the sky like a silent dare, its shadow stretching over a world that feels both endless and suffocating all at once. That's where I found myself staring, lost in thought, as the hum of our old SUV faded into the crisp mountain air. My name is Charlotte, and at 39, I've carved out a life that's steady, predictable, maybe even a little too safe. But as I stood there, gazing at that untamed ridge, something inside me stirred, a restless itch I couldn't quite name. I've been married to Ethan for 12 years now, a man who's as solid as the granite underfoot, 42 years old with a quiet strength that's both my anchor and, sometimes, my cage. We've built a life together in the flat, unremarkable sprawl of a small Midwestern town, where the days blend into each other like the muted grays of winter. He's a mechanic, hands always stained with grease, and I'm a bookkeeper. My world reduced to columns of numbers that never quite add up to anything extraordinary. We don't have kids, not by choice but by circumstance, and that empty space in our home echoes louder some days than others. This trip to the mountains wasn't just a getaway. It was a lifeline, a chance to breathe air that wasn't heavy with routine. Ethan had suggested it months ago, his voice low and hopeful over dinner one night, saying we needed to reconnect, to find each other again in a place far from the grind. I'd nodded, half listening, but the idea took root. The mountains, rugged, wild, and so far from our neatly ordered life, felt like a promise of something different. So here we were, after a long, winding drive through roads that seemed to twist tighter with every mile, finally stepping out into a landscape that felt like it could swallow us whole. The cabin we'd rented sat nestled in a valley, a small, weathered thing with creaking floors and windows that framed views too vast to comprehend. It smelled of pine and something older, like secrets pressed into the wood. I remember unpacking our bags that first afternoon, the silence between us heavier than the duffel I dropped on the floor. Ethan was outside, checking the perimeter or whatever it is men do when they need to feel useful, while I stood by the window, watching the light bleed gold over the peaks. My mind wandered to the years we've spent together, the way our marriage has settled into a rhythm that's comforting, but sometimes stifling. There are nights when we lie side by side, close enough to touch but miles apart, and I wonder if he feels it too, the unspoken distance. And there are other moments, rare and electric, when we collide with a hunger that reminds me why we're still here, tangled in sheets with a desperate kind of need that I can only describe as a storm breaking loose. Those stolen hours, when we're raw and unguarded, are a language we don't speak often enough. As I think back to those fleeting, intense moments with Ethan that I mentioned earlier, the ones that burn through the quiet of our everyday life, I can still feel the heat of them, like a wildfire catching in the dry brush of our routine. They're the kind of memories that linger, a reminder of a connection that's deeper than words, a raw, unspoken dance of need and release that stitches us back together when everything else feels frayed. But that fire seemed so far away as we drove deeper into the mountains the next day, leaving the cabin behind for a scenic route we'd mapped out over coffee that morning. The road was steep and narrow, a ribbon of gravel and dirt with no guardrails to shield us from the sheer drop on one side. Dense pine forests pressed in close, their shadows flickering across the windshield of our old Subaru as we climbed higher, the air growing thinner and sharper with every mile. Then it happened. Halfway up that unforgiving incline, the engine let out a sickly sputter, a sound like a cough that wouldn't clear. It choked once, twice, then died altogether, the car rolling to a sluggish stop on the gravel shoulder with an eerie groan of tires against stone. And just like that, silence swallowed us whole. Not the comforting kind of quiet, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that made the world feel too big and us too small. I glanced at Ethan, my heart already picking up speed, but his face was unreadable as he gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale. He turned the key again and again, each attempt met with nothing but a faint click. The Subaru was dead, and so was any hope of moving forward. I fumbled for my phone, a reflex from a life tethered to technology, only to see the screen mock me with 0 bars. No signal, no lifeline, just like we'd wanted for this so-called unplugged escape. Now, that choice felt like a trap. Outside, dusk was creeping in fast, the sky bruising into a deep, ominous purple. The temperature was dropping too, the chill seeping through the car windows as the last slivers of daylight bled away. My hands fidgeted with the hem of my sweater, twisting the fabric until it frayed at the edges, while Ethan stayed calm, too calm, almost. He popped the hood, grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the fading light to take a look. I watched him through the windshield, his broad shoulders hunched as he peered into the engine, the beam of light darting over metal and wires. "Might be the alternator," he muttered after a minute, his voice muffled through the glass, but I could tell he was grasping at straws. Ethan's good with machines, but this felt different, like even he didn't believe his own guess. I cracked the window and called out, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "What if we just wait? Someone's gotta come by eventually, right?" He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and shook his head slowly, the fading light casting shadows across his face. "Not likely, Charlotte. We're too far off the main drag. I'm gonna walk back a bit, see if I can find help or a signal. Stay here. Keep the doors locked." His tone was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet urgency that made my stomach twist. I nodded, though every part of me wanted to argue, to beg him not to leave me alone in this desolate place. But I knew better than to push when he'd made up his mind. So I watched him go, his figure shrinking into the twilight, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the encroaching dark like a fragile thread of hope. Minutes bled into what felt like hours. The cold bit deeper, creeping into my bones as I huddled in the passenger seat, my breath fogging up the window. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my heart lurch, my eyes darting to the empty road ahead and behind. The mountains loomed like silent judges, their peaks swallowed by night now, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being utterly insignificant in this vast, untamed wilderness. My mind spun with worst-case scenarios, Ethan lost, hurt, or worse. I tried to anchor myself with memories of us, of those rare, fiery moments when we'd lose ourselves in each other, when the world melted away and it was just us, tangled in a desperate kind of closeness that spoke louder than any words. But even those thoughts couldn't warm me now, not with the darkness pressing in and the silence screaming in my ears. Then, finally, I saw it. A faint, bobbing light in the distance, cutting through the black like a beacon. My chest loosened, a wave of relief washing over me so strong I almost laughed out loud. Ethan was coming back. I pressed my face to the glass, straining to see, my breath catching as the light grew closer. He wasn't alone. 3 figures trailed behind him, their silhouettes broad and hulking against the dim twilight. My relief curdled into something uneasy, a prickle of doubt needling at the back of my mind. Who were they? Why were they with him? I stayed in the car, my hand hovering over the lock, watching as they approached, their shapes becoming clearer with every step. They were men, rough-hewn and weathered, like they'd been carved from the mountains themselves. Their faces were hard, etched with lines of a life lived outdoors, their hands calloused and thick from labor. They wore worn flannel shirts, the kind that had seen too many seasons, and heavy work boots caked with mud. The first was a burly man with a graying beard that framed a stern jaw, his eyes glinting with something unreadable under the brim of a faded cap. The second was younger, leaner, with sharp, piercing eyes that seemed to cut right through me even from a distance. The third didn't speak, didn't even look at me at first, but his presence was commanding, a quiet intensity radiating from him like heat off asphalt. They stopped a few feet from the car, standing in a loose semicircle behind Ethan, who turned to me with a tight, forced smile. "Charlotte, these are locals," he said, his voice oddly flat. "This is Travis, Cole, and Marcus. They saw me walking and offered to help. They've got a community nearby, off-grid. Say they can tow the car, get us some gas, and help us get back on the road." I nodded slowly, my gaze flickering between Ethan and the men. Travis, the bearded one, stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, and tipped his head in a curt greeting. "We don't see many folks out this way," he said, his voice low and gruff, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "But we're happy to lend a hand, under certain conditions." My stomach dropped at that, a cold dread pooling in my gut. Conditions? What did that mean? I looked to Ethan, searching his face for some kind of reassurance, some sign that he'd shut this down if it went too far. But his expression stayed blank, a wall I couldn't break through no matter how hard I searched for a crack. I sat there, frozen in the passenger seat, the cold air seeping through the slightly cracked window and biting at my skin. My breath came in shallow bursts, fogging up the glass as I wrestled with a storm of emotions tearing me apart from the inside. Anger burned hot in my chest. Anger at Ethan for dragging me into this mess, for leaving me alone in the dark, only to come back with strangers who carried an air of menace like a second skin. How could he put us in this position? Fear gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering that if I refused whatever these conditions were, we'd be stranded out here, miles from help, with no way to escape the suffocating grip of these mountains. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something I didn't want to admit. A strange, unexpected curiosity. What would it feel like to cross this line? To step into the unknown, even if just for a moment? The thought made my stomach churn with a mix of dread and something I couldn't quite name. Outside, the men murmured among themselves, their voices low and rough, carried by the chilly breeze. I couldn't make out their words, but the tone sent a shiver down my spine, like they were sizing up a prize. Travis, with his graying beard and hard eyes, glanced my way now and then, his gaze heavy with intent. Cole, the leaner one, kept his piercing stare fixed on me through the window, unblinking, while Marcus, the silent giant, stood like a sentinel, his presence alone enough to make my pulse race. And then there was Ethan, standing apart from them, just beyond the hood of the car. He watched me with that same unreadable look, his face a mask I couldn't decipher. Was it guilt? Resignation? Or something darker? I needed answers, needed to understand why he wasn't fighting this, why he wasn't protecting us like he always had. I rolled the window down a little more, the cold air rushing in like a slap, and called out to him, my voice trembling with desperation. "Ethan, why are you doing this? Why are you letting this happen? Tell me something, anything." My words hung in the air, raw and pleading, but his response was cryptic, cutting deeper than the mountain wind. "Sometimes you have to give up something to get what you need," he said, his voice low, almost hollow. I blinked, confusion swirling in my mind. What did that even mean? Give up what? Get what? There was no time to unpack his riddle, no space to demand clarity. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, heavy as the looming peaks around us, silent witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest as I pushed the car door open, the hinges creaking in protest. Stepping out, my legs felt like they might give way beneath me. shaky and unsteady as a newborn fawn. The gravel crunched under my boots, each step echoing in the stillness, a sound that felt louder than it should have in this desolate place. The cold bit into my exposed skin, my breath visible in the frosty air as I faced the men. Travis stepped closer, his bulk towering over me, his breath puffing out in white clouds as he repeated their terms with a predatory grin that made my skin crawl. His words were a demand, a twisted bargain that left no room for negotiation, a price for their help that made my throat tighten with shame and fear. I won't spell it out, but let's just say it was a trade that stripped away more than just dignity, a moment of surrender that felt like a betrayal of everything I thought I knew about myself. I turned back to Ethan one last time, my eyes pleading for him to intervene, to give me a sign, any sign, that I should stop this before it went too far. But he just stood there, his silhouette framed against the dark outline of the mountains, and gave a slight nod, as if granting permission. That nod was a knife to my heart, sharper than any words could have been. As I stood there, trembling on the gravel, the weight of Ethan's nod pressed down on me like a physical force, a silent betrayal that cut deeper than the icy wind whipping through the pines. The night had fully claimed the mountains now, the vast, starlit sky stretching endlessly above us, a cold, indifferent witness to what was about to unfold. The pine trees swayed in the breeze, their whispers mingling with the distant howl of the wind, as if the wilderness itself was murmuring its judgment. I felt small, exposed, and yet there was a strange pull inside me, a current I couldn't fight, dragging me toward a line I never thought I'd cross. Travis, Cole, and Marcus closed in, their presence suffocating, their eyes glinting with a hunger that made my skin prickle. The hood of our old Subaru was right behind me, its metal surface gleaming faintly under the starlight, and I knew what they wanted, what they expected as payment for their so-called help. My breath hitched as I backed against it, the cold steel biting into my thighs through my jeans, a sharp, grounding shock against the chaos in my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, to shove them away and demand Ethan step in, but my voice was trapped in my throat, smothered by fear and something else, something darker, more confusing, that I didn't want to name. At first, I resisted, my hands pushing against Travis's broad chest as he loomed over me, his rough, calloused fingers gripping my arms with a force that left no room for doubt. The smell of earth and sweat clung to him, raw and primal, mixing with the crisp scent of pine in the air. Cole was there too, his sharp gaze cutting into me as his hands found my waist, while Marcus, silent and imposing, stood close, his touch heavy and unyielding. The cold metal of the car hood pressed harder against my back as I was guided down, a stark contrast to the heat of their hands, rough and insistent, mapping out territory I'd guarded for so long. My jacket was tugged away, the frigid air biting at my exposed skin, sending shivers racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. I stole a glance at Ethan, standing just a few feet away, his figure half-shadowed in the dim light. His face was a mask, stoic and unreadable, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond us. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't intervene. That stillness was a betrayal in itself, sharper than any blade, slicing through the vows we'd made, the life we'd built. How could he just stand there, watching as I was pulled into this storm? How could he let this happen? My mind screamed at him, begged for a reaction, but there was nothing, just that hollow, distant gaze, as if he'd already checked out of this moment, out of us. My initial fight faded, crumbling under the weight of their persistence and the surreal reality of where I was, under that endless sky, surrounded by mountains that seemed to loom in silent condemnation. Something shifted inside me, a surrender I didn't expect, a primal current that overtook the fear and shame. I stopped pushing, stopped resisting, and let myself fall into it, a strange, wild release that felt like breaking chains I hadn't even known were there. The cold metal beneath me, the roughness of their grip, the heavy breaths filling the air, it all blurred into a rush I couldn't deny. I felt a surge, a twisted mix of exhilaration and guilt, a heat blooming in my core that I hadn't felt in years, not even in those rare, electric moments with Ethan. I hated myself for it, for the way my body responded, for the way I felt alive in a way I hadn't since the monotony of my life had swallowed me whole. But I couldn't lie to myself. I was caught in the thrill, swept up in the raw, untamed energy of it all, even as my heart ached with the weight of what I was doing. My thoughts spun in a chaotic whirl as it unfolded. I thought of my marriage, of the promises I'd made to Ethan under a different sky. As the dust of that harrowing night settled in my mind, I found myself standing there, numb and hollow, watching Travis, Cole, and Marcus hook up our old Subaru to their rusted tow truck. The gravel crunched under their heavy boots as they worked with a practiced efficiency, their gruff voices barely audible over the whisper of the wind through the pines. They dragged the car a short distance down the uneven road, the tires scraping against the dirt until we reached what I could only describe as a makeshift garage, a ramshackle shed tucked into a clearing, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to guard their secrets. The air was thick with the scent of oil and pine sap as they popped the hood, inspecting the engine with curt nods to each other. One of them, Marcus, I think, hauled over a dented jerry can, the slosh of gasoline inside echoing in the stillness as he poured it into our tank. No words were exchanged beyond what was necessary, just a few grunts and a rough pat on the roof of the car when they were done. Travis stepped forward, his graying beard catching the faint glow of a lantern hanging from a nearby post, and muttered, "Good luck out there. Stick to the main roads." His tone was gravelly, final, like he was washing his hands of us. Then, without another glance, the three of them turned and melted back into the dark woods, their heavy footsteps fading until the night swallowed them whole. I stood by the car, my breath still uneven, my body feeling like it belonged to someone else. Ethan was already at the driver's side, his silhouette rigid against the pale moonlight filtering through the canopy above. We didn't speak as I slid into the passenger seat, the door creaking shut with a sound that felt too loud in the oppressive quiet. The silence between us was a living thing, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me as I stared out the window at the shadowed shapes of the trees. Ethan turned the key, and the engine roared to life, a sudden jarring sound that made me flinch. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow mountain road ahead as we began our slow descent. The pale moonlight painted everything in ghostly shades of silver and gray, the world outside feeling as distant and unreal as a dream, or a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Inside, I was a mess of tangled thoughts, my mind replaying every moment of what had happened, trying to stitch together some kind of understanding. Guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless, a bitter taste in the back of my throat for the boundaries I'd crossed, for the way my body had betrayed me with its own reckless hunger. But beneath that guilt, there was something else, something I didn't want to face, a complete lack of regret. I couldn't deny it, no matter how much I tried to bury it under layers of shame. What had unfolded under that starlit sky had awakened something in me, something raw and untamed that I hadn't known was there. It wasn't just about the act itself, the surrender to a moment I never saw coming. It was about the way it had stripped me down to my core, leaving me exposed and, in some twisted way, alive. I hated myself for feeling that, for not being able to summon the remorse I knew I should carry. But it was there, undeniable, a dark thread woven into the fabric of who I was now. The car rumbled along the winding path, each bump and turn jarring me out of my spiraling thoughts, only to pull me right back in. I glanced at Ethan, his profile sharp against the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his hands tight on the wheel. His silence was a wall, impenetrable, and it fueled a sudden, burning need to break through it. My voice came out hoarse, scraped raw from the emotions I'd been choking down. "Ethan, why? Why did you let it happen? Why didn't you fight for me back there?" The words hung between us, heavy with accusation, trembling with the hurt I couldn't hide. I needed him to say something, anything, to make sense of his inaction, to bridge the chasm that had opened up between us on that gravel shoulder. He didn't respond, his silence echoing louder than any words could. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.